Hello, my name is Jared Stevens. Some of you I may know, some of you I may not. So, hello. Um, I am doing my critical thinking movie review on Hamilton, as I'm sure a lot of us are doing. But I was very excited to be able to review this movie. So, without further ado, I will do so. And I have a lot of information. I'm going to try to go as quick as possible. Hamilton is a musical written by Lin-Manuel Miranda, and it began performing in 2015. And a high production filming of the performance was distributed by Disney in 2020, directed by Thomas Kail. Um, Hamilton's actually a adaptation. It's considered an adaptation of a book biography of Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. Sorry, excuse me. And it's this book right here. Um, Lin-Manuel Miranda had read this book, and he was so inspired by it that he wanted to make a musical by Hamilton, and also invited Ron Chernow as a consultant on the project. That being said, I would say it's fairly accurate. I would say it's very accurate. Obviously, it takes artistic liberties as it is a form of entertainment media. It does take some artistic liberties. It does, have some dramatic elements that are added that may, be a little bit different than the actual historical events. But I don't think they alter anything about the depictions and um, what they're trying to communicate about Alexander Hamilton's life. I think a lot of the historical events are very accurate. But as always, there are some inaccuracies, and I'll go through them. But I'm going to start with the accuracies. Some people might consider this as an inaccuracy, but I would say it's an accuracy, and it's the 10 Dual Commandments. Obviously, that's a play off a song by Biggie. This is a hip-hop driven musical, and so obviously they made some callbacks, and I won't name the song, but it is calling back to a song by Biggie. And some may consider it an inaccuracy because there's really more than 10 Dual Commandments. But there were dual commandments, and I think a lot of people would not know that. There were guidelines and etiquettes to a duel, and I think today we think of like the Wild West and it's, barbaric kind of like gunslinger kind of thing, outlaw kind of situation, there's room for that assumption, but there were some guidelines and etiquette to a duel, which I think a lot of people would not know, and a lot of the ones given in the musical were true, like the idea of if cooler heads couldn't prevail, if they couldn't make a peace deal between the two people to avoid a duel, they had a second man that would go on their behalf, and would try to negotiate either a peace terms or terms of the duel. And there really was a doctor on site that would they would have some form of deniability, but there was a doctor on site. So I think that's really interesting, a really interesting thing to add. That kind of just adds to a little interesting fact about colonial America. Maybe maybe we should still have duels. I joke, but I know it's. I think it's an interesting fact. Another interesting thing that was really accurate that I think was portrayed greatly in the musical is the relationship between George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. They really did have a close relationship. There were many instances in the musical where it really showed how close they were. Obviously, there were some dramatic elements added to some of their confrontations and all of that kind of stuff. But there really was a good relationship between the two. And I think one good example of it is actually found in the book, and it's communicated in the it's very communicated in the musical. But the book that the musicals adapted from actually has a story in the beginning where Eliza, in her old age, is looking over some of the paintings, busts, and memories of her old husband, and she's reminiscing over them. And she points to a silver wine cooler that was given to her by George Washington in the during the scandal between Alexander Hamilton and the Reynolds. And she talks about how George Washington had given that to her as a gesture of kindness during that difficult time, how horrible that situation was. And I think that's a really cool thing. I think it shows, along with, George Washington, letting, receiving letters from Eliza about, wanting her husband back home and him obliging, letting him go back home. It shows that relationship between George Washington and Alexander, but also just between George Washington's care for his family. Not only that, as it shows, Washington's kind of his deep feeling and deep emotional, character that we didn't get as a, public. We saw him and see him as this stoic, majestic, almost statue-like, glorious figure. And that's what he let on. That he didn't let us see the other, side of him. But, along with instances like this and instances, and actually Ron Chernow, the same writer, writes another book about George Washington that I actually own, and it's very good. I recommend it. But shows this deep feeling George Washington that we never got as an American people, as people who both people lived with him or lived in his day, and us as we look back on him. And I think it's a really cool thing a lot of a cool insight to see about George Washington. So those are some of the accuracies. Here's some inaccuracies. The first one is that Martha Washington's cat was not named Alexander Hamilton, after Alexander Hamilton, I should say, excuse me. And I would not add that had, that would probably just be a throwaway line just to kind of reinforce, the tension between Aaron Burr and just the, character and charisma of Alexander Hamilton, how everyone loved him. That would just be a throwaway line. Had Lin-Manuel Miranda not come behind Leslie Odom Jr. as he's singing it and say it's true in the musical, even though it's really not, it's just very ironic. So that's one inaccuracy. The second inaccuracy, and it's kind of an umbrella, and that is that Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton's confrontations did not exactly play out how they did in the musical. And they definitely didn't play out as soon in the timeline as the musical portrays. Obviously, in the musical, they want to build the tension between Hamilton and Aaron Burr early, as that's the main driving plot point in the entire play. But that is not the case. So one example is that, in the beginning, they did not meet that soon. Secondly, Aaron Burr was not Charles Lee's second man in the dueling match between John Lawrence and Charles Lee. If you remember, Charles Lee says stuff about George Washington that's unfavorable. And John Lawrence, Alexander Hamilton don't like it. John Lawrence offers to duel him. And Aaron Burr is depicted as Charles Lee's second man. He was not. That's just another instance where they were trying to build that tension between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Secondly, James Madison, Aaron Burr, and Thomas Jefferson, they were not the ones that confronted Alexander Hamilton when they thought around in the events surrounding the Reynolds pamphlet, the Reynolds scandal. They confronted him in the musical, they confronted him about allocating funds. He was the Treasury. He was over the finances in the U.S. He was Secretary of Treasury. And Alexander Hamilton admitted he was not wrongfully allocating funds, but he was paying off somebody in the Reynolds. Excuse me, sorry, I had a brain freeze. But it was actually Frederick Muhlenberg, Abraham Venable, and future President James Monroe, which is actually very interesting in and of itself. But again, they're trying to build that tension, and so they, made them the proprietors of that confrontation. They were not a part of that. The third one is that the election of 1800 was not the main dispute between Hamilton and Burr. That is, in the play, that's what drove them to duel, but it was actually Aaron Burr's mayoral candidacy, his failed run for mayor that Hamilton had a hand in, which really didn't have much of an effect. But there were some things said in public and private that got back to both of them, and Aaron Burr called out Alexander Hamilton. That's when they dueled. So those are some of the inaccuracies, I think the major inaccuracies. But other than that, I think it's a pretty accurate play. And so to go into some of the 5 C's, the big inaccuracy that some historians have about the musical is that the musical portrays the Founding Fathers as having a heavy view on abolitionism, and how they were, in the play, they depict them as very strong abolitionists. And they say, historians and people who, TikTok historians pretty much, internet historians, claim that that's not the case because they own slaves. And I think that is very dishonest to history. I think that lacks context into where they were living. And I will start this discussion, and I will be quick because I know I'm running over time. I will start with a quote by George Washington in regards to owning slaves. He said that slavery was, and I quote, the only unavoidable subject of regret. And he further says in a later comment that I never mean unless some particular circumstance should compel to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by the legislature by which slavery in the country may be abolished by a slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. there's comments like that, comments made by Alexander, John Lawrence, um, excuse me, Thomas Jefferson, that are along those lines. I think what people lack is the fact that while horrible, while terrible, the country was our nation and our society was pretty much built off of the backs of indentured servitude, whether that be slavery, whether that be people who came over from England, Ireland. Um, it was built off the backs of indentured slavery. And by this time, it was so ingrained in our society. A lot of these were born into plantations and owning slaves. Some of them had slaves since children. And so, while it's horrible, while it's terrible, they were abolitionists. They did want to abolish slavery. The issue was that it was so baked in our society that it was going to take a while. They knew it was going to take a little bit. They knew that it was going to be a hard transfer, like it was going to be a hard thing to enact into law, being that everyone had slaves. Every plantation was being worked by slaves, and the South was going to have an issue with not having slavery abolished very in the foreseeable future. Obviously, that was a big thing. But I think it's unfair to say, I think it's fair to criticize that slavery should not have been here in the first place. I think that's a fair criticism. I think that we should not have brought slaves over. I think and slavery was horrible. That's a good criticism. Should not have happened. But what I think is not fair is to say that they were not abolitionists, because they were. But it was such a complex situation at the time. It was such almost like he says, an unavoidable subject of regret. To them, it was unavoidable. And while, we can fathom that or not, because, it's easy for us in our postmodern, brains and minds to say, oh, unavoidable, like just don't own slaves. Well, it was a serious, that was a societal thing back then. Like, you own slaves. If you had a farm, you owned slaves. And while that's horrible, I think it's unfair to judge them and their feelings towards slavery based off of that. So that's my 2 cents. Obviously, I'm not a historian, so I'm not qualified maybe to make some of those. But that's from what I've researched. This is just some takeaways I had from the musical. I think in regards to that, I think the musical maybe could have had a better contextual conversation about slavery. But I think either way, people would have had an issue with it, because they don't like to see that the Founding Fathers really wanted to abolish slavery. I think they just want to paint them in a bad light. But anyway, thank you for your time. I know I went over, but I hope you enjoy, and I thank you. So, there you go.